Lord Boxman started out wanting to build a robot army strong enough to defeat Point. Look at his early interactions with his first sapient robot, Mr. Logic. This was his original business partner, someone he invented to help fill in what gaps and blind spots he might have, someone he wanted active feedback and suggestions from. Boxman himself was a lot more open-minded, patient, and collaborative at this point in time. He immediately called Mr. Logic his best friend and treated him with warm, open affection. Mr. Logic advised Boxman that he shouldn't immediately jump at his goal because he didn't yet have the manpower or resources to pose a legitimate threat. Instead, Mr. Logic proposed using Boxman's inventing abilities to tweak and improve upon his current inventions, to sell these inventions to other villains, and build a villain supply chain store. With time, hard work, and concentrated efforts, Boxman would eventually have the resources and power to successfully launch an attack later. It was a big picture, long-haul plan. The Mr. Logic Boxman team led to building the main Boxmore company headquarters, and establishing Boxman as a trusted robot minion supplier. Unfortunately, Boxman isn't a big picture man. He didn't stop to consider that heroes could also start up and maintain a hero supply chain. Suddenly, Point wasn't an abstract, someday goalpost anymore. The heroes were right in Boxman's backyard, with the presence of Mr. Gar and the developing Lakewood Plaza Turbo. Boxman thought he had ample time to become an indomitable powerhouse, but if the heroes had the same advantage, he'd never be able to catch up, and had to address that problem now. When Mr. Logic said to ignore Lakewood Plaza, Boxman was too lost in himself to listen. He felt threatened and intimidated enough that it stoked his insecurities and anxieties. When Mr. Logic ventured out to investigate Lakewood Plaza, it could be seen as someone talking to the other that their parent, friends, or whomever paint with broad strokes and demonized. Boxman told Mr. Logic that his role was to fill in the logical inconsistencies with his plans, but he never asked Mr. Logic what he wanted to do with his life. With Boxman, everything was tailored to realizing Boxman's dreams and ambitions. When Mr. Logic spoke to Mr. Gar, it was partly about what the plaza was for, and what Mr. Gar hoped for the future, with the other part inviting Mr. Logic to share his plans for the future. Plans about and for himself, not just the sustainability of Boxmore. After Mr. Logic had his perspective broadened and returned to Boxmore wanting something fundamentally different from Boxman's new "destroy the plaza" direction, it was a straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. Boxman was already knee-deep in plans to stop this new existential threat, to have full control over his environment and his life. When Mr. Logic challenged Boxman's worldview, Boxman saw it as a challenge to him personally. Seriously considering Mr. Logic's arguments here meant that Boxman would have to self-reflect in a way that he wasn't equipped to. So if Boxman had to shave down Mr. Logic's personhood to a black and white concept of obstacle in my way to safeguard his ego, that's what needed to be done. The episode Lad and Logic is a fantastic launchpad to unpacking Boxman's screwed up dynamic with his other children. His creator-robot minion dynamic is an allegory for an emotionally abusive parent that sees their children as extensions of themselves rather than full, autonomous beings with their own wants and desires. Mr. Logic was fully self-actualized and wanted something different than Boxman. Despite what he said out loud, Boxman knew that Mr. Logic was on even footing with him. Everything came down to power dynamics. So when Boxman invented his next set of robots, he opted to be their parent because of the power imbalance he could exploit. Shannon, Daryl, Raymond, and others strictly and obediently follow their father's wishes because they were deliberately conditioned and threatened to. Boxman pits them against each other to vie for his favor. The only TV they're allowed to watch at home are movies he carefully filmed to reinforce his father knows best agenda. It's similar to strict Christian parents banning their kids from watching certain shows or reading certain books because they may contain undesirable properties. Anything that encourages their child to question Christianity or endorses more critical thinking about their household values, period, is a threat to their authority in maintaining a functional household. While Daryl, Shannon, and Raymond seem satisfied with their lives, unconditionally love their father, and gleefully attack the plaza, every time Boxman threatens them with the furnace or yells at them for failing, it's an exaggerated, blunt example of bad parenting. The furnace is a catch-all punishment for not being able to meet or exceed Boxman's expectations with anything and everything. He leaves some amount of ambiguity in his demands so that he can tug the proverbial leash every time he feels he needs to. Granted, it's important to look at everything that led up to Lord Cowboy Darrell. Boxman's most egregious display of favoritism was when he built Boxman Jr. and refused to acknowledge how stung Darrell was. He kept pushing how much stronger, more competent, and better Boxman Jr. was overall. Generally, Darrell's respective relationships with Shannon and Raymond were strong enough to buffer against Boxman's picking favorites tactic. They'll fight each other for Dad's affection, but there was always an implicit understanding that they had each other's backs under normal circumstances. Junior is different in that he had no significant relationship with his other siblings. Only Boxman. And Boxman blatantly showered the newest addition with praise and affection the others never received. Pushed to his limit, Darrell took matters into his own hands and staged an effective coup d'etat against Boxman. Through his disillusionment with his father, Darrell stepped up and became the focused, tight-knuckled business operator that Boxman could never be. Boxman tried to fill the mold that Mr. Logic helped him create and focus on appeasing his board of directors. But his all-consuming obsession with destroying the plaza was always his true life's goal and work. This was such a core part of his character that he was miserable and hollow if he gave up on that goal. In contrast, Darrell can follow orders and do what needs to be done with whatever task he's given. The result of Lord Cowboy Darrell was one potential future of Darrell as a self-actualized villain, without Boxman putting him down and actively demoralizing him. After KO convinces Boxman to talk to Darrell and tell him he's proud of his achievements, it leads to the pivotal moment that Boxman couldn't give Mr. Logic. For once, Boxman looked at one of his kids and saw them as a separate, autonomous being rather than an extension of himself. For that brief moment, he placed Darrell on equal footing. Darrell took over Boxmore partly out of spite, but also out of an earnest interest in following in Boxman's footsteps. Without Boxman, he's a better Boxman. With Boxman, he's a co-conspirator that's as eager to destroy the plaza as Boxman is. Enter Professor Venomous. In stark contrast to Lord Boxman, Professor Venomous and Fink call themselves boss and minion respectively, but it's really a father-daughter relationship. Venomous makes a point of bringing Fink along to important events or letting her tag along where relevant. He brings along what extras are needed to accommodate Fink, whether it's a high chair, crayons, or even glores for a high-powered attack on some heroes. At their best, Venomous makes a point to talk to Fink on her level, and she speaks very highly of what kind, affectionate gestures he does for her. Where Venomous trips up is discipline. Fink can do whatever she wants. Babysitters are run over by her reckless energy and disregard for other people that aren't Venomous. Any sign of a complaint or a tantrum is pacified with an expensive gift. When Venomous starts getting overwhelmed, the gifts replace all usual attempts at parenting or communication period. After rewatching OK KO recently, knowing that Professor Venomous was KO's biological father from the beginning, perhaps the boss and minion labels were Venomous's coping mechanism for knowing he abandoned one of his kids. It was easier to interact with and care for Fink as long as she was his minion. That's a different enough relationship that he can compartmentalize it and distance it from whatever guilt or regrets he had from his past as Laser Blast. When Boxman became business partners with Professor Venomous, it led to obvious shifts in his approach to parenting. After his night out with Venomous and Darrell and Shannon babysitting, he gave them t-shirts as rewards for their efforts. No pushes at playing favorites or nitpicking for once. With Professor Venomous in the picture, Boxman finally had the business partner he wanted and needed. While Mr. Logic's approach worked beautifully for kickstarting Boxmore, Boxman needed Venomous to cultivate it into exactly what he wanted, versus what it was when tied to a board of directors. For a short time, Boxman and Venomous were building a blended family that was more successful together than separately. Boxman encouraged exercises and attempts towards Fink and Darrell getting along better. The Boxbots all received personalized upgrades from Venomous to improve and augment what weaponry or abilities they had. Fink now had access to what toys Boxman could invent that were several grades above what Venomous could just buy. In short, Boxman dating Venomous led to him becoming a more proactive parent in a surprisingly organic way. Venomous's intense self-destructive and literally destructive stint as shadowy Venomous further elucidated what impact he had on Boxman. When Boxman had to step up as a responsible parent, the first problem he addressed with Venomous was how he'd been failing Fink recently with the "You missed Fink's recorder recital" comment. He was also emotionally strong enough to realize that Venomous was causing enough problems in the household that things had reached a boiling point and he had to leave. Breaking up would be emotionally devastating for him, but Boxman was prioritizing the emotional well-being of his house and kids overall. Even the devastating scene where Boxman leaves his kids to go off in an ambiguous finding myself quest was meaningful improvement on his part. Similarly to his confrontation with Lord Cowboy Darrell, but with all of his kids this time, Boxman told them that they didn't need him. He was cutting the dependent and toxic grip on his apron strings. The Box kids are resilient and capable enough that they could carve out their own path. There's a quote that Boxman brings up in another episode. "I'm a villain. I'm not a monster." In context, the quote was a punchline for a dark joke about Boxman potentially being a cannibal. Though, it interestingly applies when looking at Boxman's actions during his confrontations with Shadowy Venomous. Shadowy was the kind of monstrous villain that wanted mindless destruction, and to watch the world burn. Seeing the absolute lowest his partner could reach led to Boxman establishing what lines he wouldn't cross. He wants to destroy the plaza, not the world, and a pretty face isn't enough to convince him otherwise when he finds the self-assurance and confidence he needed. It's the peak of his character development as a father. While there is a lot more room for exploring this part of Boxman's character, there's enough substantial story here that it's an interesting look at a bad dad that was actively working on becoming better. Boxman and Venomous get back together later, but only after Venomous proves that he's working through his bigger issues in a meaningful way with real, tangible results. Over the last several years, there have been several stories tackling generational trauma that include parents realizing their failings and working on course correcting with those failings. This has been a point of contention about a recurring to the point of tired stories in recent Pixar animated movies, and the core of what made Everything, Everywhere, All at Once the powerhouse that it is. It's not too far of a reach to include Boxman as another one of these stories, or even a decent starting place for digging into stories or characters dealing with generational trauma. In Boxman's case, he could be seen as an example of an insecure parent that uses their role as a parent to reassure themselves in a constantly changing, unpredictable world. He only starts to get better when he starts changing and adapting to fit into that unpredictable world, rather than trying to make his little corner of the world continue to conform to just him alone. Point's origin and show starts when Silver Spark, Elbow, and Rippy Roo officially join the main team as junior members. Laser Blast and Silver Spark immediately take a liking to each other, and Laser Blast comes up with convenient excuses for alone time with Silver. From what little there is of them on screen, Silver is absolutely infatuated with Laser. Partly because of his flashy attitude, his years of experience, the air of mystery around him, and definitely the confidence. These two were in the early honeymoon phase of their relationship. Elbow's graphic daydream involving the weird sucker French kiss sequence tells the whole story. If these two weren't working, they were doing other things. Very often, and very enthusiastically. Besides tonsil hockey with Silver, Laser Blast has a series of questionable projects he's been working on in a secret donut shop lair. Dr. Grayman, the brains behind Point, discovered two of Laser's mysterious orbs, and the consensus was these were made by villains. When Laser suggests using them to stop bad guys, Grayman immediately shuts him down, citing that they're too dangerous for anyone to use. Grayman accidentally sets off one of the orbs and loses all of his powers. The new mission is find and apprehend the perpetrator. Laser prioritizes covering up his lair and experiments. He's more concerned about his image and standing than the well-being of his teammate. When he goes with Silver and Elbow to scope out the donut shop, he insists on going first, and alone. He puts on a show about how brave he is, and promises Silver he'll be back. Then Laser enters the donut shop and disappears into a black hole. Silver is heartbroken and devastated. She blames Elbow for keeping her from potentially making it in time for that small possible window of opportunity to save Laser. This causes a rift in their friendship for years after. Point unceremoniously drops Elbow and plants him as solely responsible for Laser's death. After that, Elbow slowly finds new meaning in actualization as Mr. Gar. It's so painful for him to think about his past. He prefers to consider El Bo as dead as Laser Blast is. Even after Carol has made peace with losing Laser, Mr. Gar is racked with guilt and grief. He still blames himself and puts up a wall between himself and Carol, despite her attempts to reach out or reconnect for a long time. In a nutshell, Carol becomes more emotionally mature, patient, and empathetic with time and introspection. She understands the importance of open, honest communication, and that's what repairs, even strengthens, her relationship with Mr. Gar once he actually talks to her. Laser made it out of the donut shop in time to avoid the black hole, and hides in a nearby storm drain. The evidence that he is responsible for the spheres is gone, but he hears Silver say he wasn't powerful enough to get out. That comment is enough to seriously wound Laser's ego. He retreats, ashamed, and feeling small and vulnerable. He lost his powers. In his mind, he's nothing without his powers. He's too insecure to face Silver Spark or anybody else. The idea of her being more powerful, that she'd potentially push him out of the way, or underestimate his abilities, is something he can't bear. So he starts desperately experimenting on himself and trying to regain his superpowers. He's connected so much of his self-worth to how powerful he was, that he doesn't know who he is without special powers. Until he can regain his former glory, he refuses to return to Point, or his former life, and he doesn't trust Silver, or anyone else enough to be vulnerable or weak in any way around them. In a way, Laser's reaction to Silver can be roughly approximated to how toxic masculinity can affect how a man views himself. Men are supposed to be strong providers. They can't show any weakness. They're the master, the cornerstone of the financial health and overall lifeblood of the household. When a man ties all of his value to a specific personal trait, like how much money he makes, or how strong he is, it's a threat when his partner makes more money than him, or she's more proficient than him at his thing. This single trait is such an important piece of his personhood that it might as well be him. It's difficult to extricate that piece and figure out a healthier approach to who he is outside of that one trait. And he's not going to talk to his partner when she seems more like a rival than a friend. For all intents and purposes, Laser Blast, at least the idea of who Laser Blast might have been, died. He becomes Professor Venomous, a respected, renowned villain that's a threat because of his scientific prowess, and powerful because of what status and money he gains as a result. He's more satisfied and satiated as a villain than he ever was as a hero. The ideas that Point balked at are celebrated and encouraged by his fellow villains. It's liberating. While Laser Blast was a mask, Professor Venomous is the closest he's been to full self-actualization. It's not full self-actualization, but he's happier as a villain than he ever was as a hero. Enter Fink. She's arguably the most important character and interpersonal relationship Venomous has. There's ample hints that Venomous rescued her from a rough life surviving by herself out in the streets. They call each other boss and minion respectively, but it's just a title. Fink is his adopted daughter. When Fink talks about him, it's with strong respect, admiration, and affection. He's a patient, gentle parent at his best. He brings Fink to every event he's allowed to. He makes sure that Fink has what appropriate weapons or toys she needs at an outing. Out of everyone Venomous interacts with, Fink is seen and intimately knows a kinder, softer side of him. It's why she stands by him, despite everything. Despite their strong relationship, though, Venomous still avoids bigger confrontations. He ran away from Carol, and avoids the reality of KO as his son when he's Professor Venomous. So when Fink starts complaining, he throws expensive toys, video games, and gadgets at her to appease her. Usually, Venomous offsets these materialistic solutions with talking to her at her level or active parenting. Though, at the height of the later shadowy figure debacle, Venomous has completely given up when he uses gifts as the only means of interacting with Fink, period. This is speculation, but it's interesting that Venomous never actively talks about himself as dad until it's a direct confrontation between shadowy Venomous and KO. Perhaps Venomous uses a set of mental gymnastics to place some degree of separation between his father-daughter relationship with Fink and his non-existent relationship with KO. Fink is his minion. She is an important piece of his daily operations as a villain. As long as KO doesn't know or realize his true identity, Venomous doesn't have to think about the fact that he abandoned his son. There's a lot of complicated baggage attached to a potential relationship with KO. If Venomous wanted to successfully navigate how they could foster a father-son relationship, or at least a friendly dynamic, it means he'd have to be more honest and introspective with himself than he's willing to. Throughout the show, viewers are introduced to KO's dark alter ego, TKO. TKO is initially treated as a separate entity. He's angry, he's frustrated, he's angsty. He wants to watch the world burn as a means of catharsis, and for his own entertainment. The truth is that TKO is a manifestation of KO's unresolved feelings about his absentee dad, always following the rules without intensely questioning why things work a certain way, questioning authority figures in general. It boils down to TKO is a personification of the existential angst that comes attached with KO growing up and becoming better acquainted with the workings of the world around him. Shadowy Figure is introduced as Professor Venomous's equivalent to TKO. Venomous thought he was content with power accumulated through money and villainous feats. That was enough for a long time, but then Venomous reached the pinnacle of villainy. He had inventions like a giant death ray, an easy button for threatening the squeamish congresswoman for obscene amounts of ill-gotten wealth. When Venomous started seeing there was more to Lord Boxman and his snidely Whiplash-esque rivalry with Lakewood Plaza, he realized he'd been in the throes of ennui. Throwing his resources and talents behind Boxman reignited his love of villainy. Boxman knew how to take risks and have fun. Unlike other villains, evil wasn't a careful, calculated set of moves, or a set of ideas that need to be run through bureaucratic red tape. Boxman's attacks leveled up in a deeply gratifying way for both of them. Yes, Venomous had a partner and lifestyle that were a fantastic fit for him, but he still hadn't confronted the trauma of losing his powers years ago. Consciously, he thought he had moved on, but really, he'd bottled up these feelings and resentment for so long, they took on a life of their own. That's where the active split between Venomous and Shadowy starts. Venomous's former glory isn't enough anymore. Now, it's a ravenous ghost that demands bigger, better, more terrifying, power that can match, if not more deeply fulfill. How long these feelings of dissatisfaction have sat untouched? When Shadowy looks at KO, he sees a direct outlet for achieving his deepest desires. Power is represented as a Dragon Ball Z-esque energy source that can destroy planets or even the universe at large. It's simultaneously an in-show love letter to shonen battle nonsense, while acting as an abstract stand-in for a parent living vicariously through their child. Shadowy Figure is the beginning phases of an overzealous parent pressuring their kid to become the sports star, the Harvard law doctor, or any number of other concepts. The parent wasn't able to achieve this goal for whatever reason, but then they look at their child as a malleable lump of clay. The child is an extension of themselves. The last chance to achieve this dream the parent holds as their penultimate achievement. This dream is more important to the parent than everything, to the degree it supersedes the fact their child is an autonomous, independent being with their own wants, dreams, and needs for their life. The child has become a tool. While there is still a degree of separation between Venomous and Shadowy, it's brief hope that he can catch himself and pump the brakes on how he's overstepping with KO. When he outright calls himself Shadowy Venomous, he's completely surrendered to his need for power. Shadowy Venomous is the realization of who and what he thought he wanted to be. It's the means to a horribly self-destructive bender. He can do whatever he wants. Nothing is a challenge or threat to his self-esteem now, because no one is more powerful, and if they are, he has means to make himself greater. KO has a solid support system between Carol and his adoptive family Mr. Gar, Enid, and Rad. Though, even with a solid support system, KO wanted some kind of relationship with his bio-dad Venomous. Parent-child relationships can be really complicated and messy. Even if a child has a fantastic mom and stepdad, the right combination of feeling unheard, misplaced, or having certain emotional needs unaddressed can make the originally absent parent appealing. Even if this other parent hasn't contributed as much, there's a want for their attention and validation. They're here now. They're trying now. They have something other loved ones can't offer. More importantly, It's a means to fill an existential hole in their life. When KO takes a moment to acknowledge TKO as part of himself that he's been grossly neglecting, he starts learning the importance of self-love, and that acknowledging and accepting his trauma is part of growing as a person. He's been able to empathize and show compassion for everybody else around him, but he refused to give himself the same kindness and patience. Shadowy Venomous exploited this. TKO hoped that Shadowy would listen to and commiserate with him in a way nobody else was, because Shadowy seemingly had a similar chip on his shoulder. They're mirrors of each other, right? That's what the wanton destruction and chaos are all about. When KO finally gives himself the consideration he needed, he realized that looking to Shadowy was never about him. It was only about being the convenient part that Shadowy needed. Shadowy was never interested in really reaching out and developing a meaningful connection with him. Because of his self-reflection, KO's relationships with his chosen family will be fuller and richer because he's including his inner voice as part of those intimate, heavy, vulnerable conversations with loved ones. Despite Professor Venomous royally fucking up, the ending montage in the last episode shows he's not completely irredeemable. KO deliberately asks about him too. At the very least, KO still cares about the professor. The president of the universe gives Venomous a personal planet to destroy. In a way, that's Venomous finally confronting how much losing his powers years ago affected him. He has a healthier means to process his feelings around that sensitive subject, and it's highly effective. He repairs his relationship with Fink. He's a more active parent than he was previously, and encourages her interests more. There's a scene where he tells Fink that he doesn't like video games, and suggests she practices her piano scales while he's gone instead of further gameplay. Years later, he's enthusiastically cheering her on from the audience after she, presumably, became a professional gamer and won a gaming tournament. Venomous also apologizes to Lord Boxman after their messy breakup during his spiraling as Shadowy Venomous. One sequence features a wedding ring! The bulk of these scenes are very fill-in-the-blank or connect-the-dots, but they're powerful. Seeing Professor Venomous with a wedding ring means that he learned how to have a vulnerable conversation with Boxman, and that they trust each other enough to make that serious of a commitment. Previous scenes are very much coded as them having a gay romance and building a blended family as business partners, but this cements it and cinches these last few parts of Professor Venomous's character arc. It's honestly beautiful how Venomous comes around to his equivalent of the healthy, satisfying life and family that Carol has between Mr. Gar and KO. A redemption arc isn't realistic for every person that fits a Professor Venomous mold, but it's meaningful to see a character like this work on himself. As an older fan, it's appreciated how much attention and care are given to found family for all these characters in a variety of situations and circumstances. Lord Boxman is the black sheep among his peers. This is first established with Professor Venomous's initial distaste towards him, and the later reactions he gets when he unexpectedly shows up at Billiam Milliam's villain yacht party. The only kinds of relationships Boxman has with other villains amount to strictly business transactions to create their robot minions. The shareholders that directly fund Boxmore are especially skeptic of Boxman's Destroy the Plaza side venture, and see this as a misguided Snidely Whiplash-esque escapade. He's just a Saturday morning cartoon villain, and they're the respectable big leagues. When Boxman funnels so much time, effort, energy, and resources towards the Plaza attacks, it takes precious time away from robot production, the one thing he does they consider valuable or worthwhile. They threaten to cut off their support if Boxman's production doesn't increase, and then gladly replace him with Daryl when the opportunity arises. Daryl fits the exact mold they need for a CEO. He focuses exclusively on production. There's no respect. There's no interest in or concern for Lord Boxman as an individual. The dislike is mutual. Of course Boxman doesn't get along with other villains. Most of the known names and faces on screen hold the purse strings, and, by extension, the fate of Boxman's entire operation. He feels like he has to put on his best face and performance to keep his business afloat. Without Boxmore, he seemingly has nothing and loses everything material. After Boxman was fired by the shareholders, he becomes absolutely depressed and floats around for a while until Venomous finds him in his trash can. As much as he hates answering to corporate interests, he's locked in as a robot manufacturer, as much as an average Joe is stuck at a 9-to-5 job because of bills, a mortgage, and most frustratingly, how easily someone can fall into the trappings of letting a job define their self-worth or sense of self. When Professor Venomous gets introduced, he's partly in Boxman's mental bucket of shareholder/necessary business relationships. Boxman goes to great lengths to hide KO, Rad, and Enid after accidentally booking his business dinner on the same night as an Antagonize the Plaza event. He's scared that his hobby would dissuade Venomous from buying any more of his robots and break their already tenuous business deal. Instead, Venomous starts to see Boxman through literal rose-tinted glasses and becomes interested in Boxman's ongoing Plaza rivalry, but uses the robots as a continued excuse to check in again on this weird, intriguing man. Another interesting precedent is that Boxman is more fond of Venomous from the jump. When interacting with his other business partners, Boxman is over the top and eager to please in video calls and plays the oblivious idiot in casual settings. But behind closed doors, he's bitter towards them. Boxman won't hug his own children and scoffs at open displays of affection. Yet he wants to touch or hug Venomous as often as he can reasonably get away with. Part of his behavior is the same eager-to-please facade he gives other interested business parties, but the bigger part is a legitimate interest in developing a more personal relationship with Venomous. The pink shoujo sparkles and elevator eyes Boxman has for Venomous are a blatant indicator he finds him attractive. That's a surprisingly huge part of what kicks off his interest. Look at how he reacts to Dr. Blight in the Captain Planet crossover. Boxman initially shows skepticism and disinterest towards her crazy plans, but the second she flirts with him, the switch flips. The promise of romantic interest grants her access to the full power and force of Boxmore. When she leaves at the end of the episode, Boxman is disappointed. He wanted to continue their partnership, especially their potential interpersonal one. In Venomous's case, he gets extra points for joining in on the fight after the Plaza Brats interrupt dinner. He asks about the design and Lego brick-esque connectivity of the box spots. He's not above participating in the Saturday morning cartoon skirmish. Rather, he misses that kind of fight and yearns to experience more exploits like it. Venomous is the only on-screen character outside of Boxman's kids that shows a willingness to listen to, try to understand, and engage with Boxman in a more personable, intimate way. Professor Venomous fell into villainy after he lost his powers and realized how overbearing he found the moral code heroes have. Being a villain comes naturally to him. He likes the fruits of his labor and the vast amounts of wealth, prestige, and material power that he can gain. Fast forward to present day in the series, and he's a picture of a successful villain. He figures out the easy button for amassing stupid amounts of money by threatening a congresswoman with a death ray. He sought out for deals involving his scientific prowess. He's respected and liked among other villains to the point he's invited to billions parties. Though, while he has a comfortable position, he's become jaded. Enter Lord Boxman. Compared to the villains Venomous is used to, Boxman dances to the beat of his own drum. He's more interested in defeating the Plaza than an endless vie for prestige, wealth, or power. He says he doesn't care what the other villains think of him, and how he does things. No matter what happens, he's going to carve out his own path as a villain and do what he wants to with his life. Somehow, Venomous got tied up in a new, different kind of bureaucratic process as a villain. As a hero, he felt like an outcast and a loser everybody looked down on without superpowers. As a villain, he has everything he thought he wanted, but it was more of a means to make up for what he lost. It was more compensating and filling in an existential hole, versus actually taking meaningful control of his life. In stark contrast to that, Boxman knows exactly what he wants and puts his all into every pursuit. Consequences and obstacles be damned. Collaborating with Boxman is an epiphany. Dreaming up new schemes and plots to challenge the Plaza is fun. It's fulfilling and satisfying to Venomous in a way that heroics and solo villain ventures weren't. There's one scene in particular after Boxman and Venomous join forces for the first time, and lose spectacularly. Both of them are smiling. It's joyous. Boxman was down and out without Boxmore, but building Fink's attack trike was a spark of hope that he can rebuild, even if it's from the ground up. Venomous just lost his nice house and all of his current material possessions because Boxman blew everything up. But then Boxman turned around and presented the exact existential solution Venomous didn't know he needed, by suggesting attacking the plaza. It's the dinner party attack, but this time, Venomous was a full part of the planning phases. He gets to share in and fully experience the devil-may-care and more whimsical parts of being a villain he thought were long gone. Venomous offers to buy out Boxmore and root out the shareholders. Finally, Boxman is free of one of the bigger obstacles between him and his all-time favorite venture. Not only does Boxman have free reign, but also the equal partner he so desperately desired. Someone that's on his same wavelength and as invested in his kind of villainy as he is. Another important dimension to Venomous's character is his destructive spiral as shadowy Venomous. Finding that missing piece in Boxman and Boxmore respectively isn't a magic solution. There's significant baggage in how much emphasis Venomous placed on his need for power. This was such a huge quest and chunk of his life that it's difficult to give up on the idea entirely. It's similar to how some people spend so much time chasing after a specific job title or promotion that this elusive thing becomes an important part of what defines them or contributes to their sense of self-worth. Venomous left Carol because of a gross misunderstanding that she saw him as weak. He was missing the value he assigned to superpowers for so long that every new solution was always a band-aid or stopgap. Someone can find a thing or circumstances that significantly improves their life, but they need to see and recognize this psychologically too for it to be completely effective. In other words, Venomous needed to recognize the real-time changes in results from joining Boxmore, then figure out how to weigh these continued changes with his own self-discovery or improvement. Boxman started improving on becoming a more proactive parent. Unfortunately, Venomous started getting lost in his own head and pulling away from his other responsibilities or general life. A change as big as a new partner, surroundings, and blended family would be enough to kickstart depression, especially because Venomous hadn't appropriately addressed why he needed this abstract concept of what it meant to be the most powerful being. Success and self-actualization weren't included in the previous accolades he achieved as a villain. It wasn't obvious and forthcoming with Boxman either. The lack of introspection and vulnerable talks with Boxman or anyone else is exactly what led to the wind-up and eventual, "I'll destroy everything," if it means getting rid of the years of resentment and frustration. Both Venomous and Boxman have some sort of adult trapped in this shitty corporate world element to their character writing. In a nutshell, Boxman struggles with the existential threat of losing who he is to one specific job he performs. Venomous finds villainy gratifying as more of a hobby or extracurricular activity versus a full-time job. He's successful at it, but the version he's successful at is more of a distraction or a means to fill in a missing part of himself than true interest in his corporate role. Boxman's approach to villainy is considered juvenile and worthless. Venomous still loves villainy, but he wants the freedom to have fun and go all out without worrying about reputation or meeting the specific standards that comes with his current position. In 2024, after the various rise of corporate buzzwords trying to guilt employees back to pre-pandemic work standards, and inflation versus stagnant wages, there is new weight to the Boxman and Venomous character allegories respectively. These two are that success story of Boxman giving the middle finger to a crappy boss, and Venomous making that leap of faith from an empty, soul-sucking job to the more wild, out-of-pocket thing. Venomous's ill-obtained funds becomes that treasured pile of fuck you money that so many people dream about having and using to take a risk on something personally and meaningfully valuable to them.
or just having a window of opportunity to enjoy life the way they want to, without having to worry about bills and necessities. More importantly though, while they describe themselves as business partners, it's two single, lonely men building a life and trying to healthfully blend their families together. Part of this life is making space for someone new that makes the other man want to work on becoming a better, more thoughtful person. Regardless of where a person sits in their job hunt, or even at the height of personal achievement, the most important part is the support network that they come home to or regularly interact with. Thematically, Boxman and Venomous are the opposite side of the coin to the more straightforward found family KO builds and maintains. It's a reminder that no one has to be lonely. They can and will find someone that brings meaningful, valuable things to their life. Someone that makes them want to change and grow. While this is about an explicitly romantic pair, the message applies whether that hypothetical person and relationship is romantic, platonic, or a new addition to a family.